Xavier O'Reilly posted the advertisement on a Wednesday morning in the summer of 1883, nailing it to the weathered board outside the general store in Ouray, Colorado, and wondering if anyone would even bother to read it. He needed a cook for his ranch, someone who could prepare decent meals for him and his 3 ranch hands without burning the beans or turning the beef into leather, and he was willing to pay fair wages for competent work. The ranch sat 5 miles outside of town, nestled in a valley surrounded by the San Juan Mountains, and it had been his life for the past 8 years since he bought it at 20 years old, with money saved from working cattle drives. Now at 28, Xavier had built something substantial, but the loneliness of the place had started weighing on him in ways he had not expected. His mother had died 2 years back, the only woman who had ever set foot on his property with any regularity, and since then, the ranch had felt more like a place to work himself into exhaustion than a home. 3 days passed before anyone responded to his advertisement. Xavier had ridden into town for supplies when the general store owner, a balding man named Patterson, told him a woman had inquired about the cook position. "A woman?" Xavier asked, shifting the weight of the flour sack he had just purchased. "Yes, sir." Said her name was Margaret Grayson, recently arrived from Kansas. She is staying at the boarding house on 7th Street, seemed real interested in the job, asked all sorts of questions about the work and the wages. Xavier felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had hoped for a cook, certainly, but having a woman on the ranch raised complications he had not fully considered. Still, beggars could not be choosers, and if she could cook better than his current situation, which consisted mainly of burnt coffee and half-raw bacon, he would take what he could get. He found the boarding house easily enough, a 2-story building painted white with green shutters that looked freshly cleaned. The landlady, a stern woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, directed him to the sitting room where Margaret Grayson waited. She stood when he entered, and Xavier found himself momentarily speechless. She was beautiful, but not in the delicate way of the women he had seen in town. She had strong features, dark brown hair pulled back practically, and green eyes that assessed him with the same directness he was using to assess her. She wore a simple cotton dress the color of faded denim, and her hands, when she extended one for him to shake, showed calluses that spoke of hard work. "Mr. O'Reilly, I presume," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Yes, madam. I understand you are interested in the cook position." "I am. I have experience cooking for large groups. I worked in my family's restaurant in Topeka for 6 years before circumstances required me to relocate." Xavier noticed she did not elaborate on those circumstances, but he did not press. Everyone in the West had a past they preferred not to discuss in detail. "The work is steady, 3 meals a day for myself and 3 ranch hands, sometimes more if we have help coming through during branding or roundup. The pay is $30 a month plus room and board. You would have your own cabin, small but private, about 50 yards from the main house." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "What happened to your previous cook?" "Never had one. Been making do on my own, but I am not skilled in that area and my men are starting to complain." Loudly. A slight smile crossed her face, softening her serious expression. "I can provide references if you need them. Patterson at the general store knows my landlady who can vouch for my character." "When can you start? Is tomorrow too soon?" Xavier felt relief wash through him. "Tomorrow is perfect. I will come by with the wagon at first light." They shook hands again, and Xavier left feeling like he had just made a wise business decision. He had no way of knowing that Margaret Grayson would change everything about his carefully ordered, lonely existence. The next morning arrived clear and cool. the way Colorado summer mornings often did before the afternoon heat set in. Xavier pulled the wagon up to the boarding house and helped Margaret load her belongings, which consisted of 2 large trunks and several canvas bags that clinked with what sounded like kitchen equipment. "You came prepared," he observed, securing the trunks in the wagon bed. "I believe in being ready for any situation. My grandmother always said a woman with her own good knives and proper pots need never depend entirely on anyone else's charity." They rode out of Ouray as the sun climbed higher, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and pink. Xavier pointed out landmarks along the way: the creek where they got water, the meadow where cattle grazed in winter, the stand of aspens that turned brilliant gold come September. Margaret listened attentively, asking practical questions about the ranch operations and the preferences of the men she would be cooking for. "Tom is the oldest," Xavier explained. "Been with me 5 years. He likes his coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe and complains about everything, but he is the hardest worker I have ever known. Pete is young, only 19, and he will eat anything you put in front of him without complaint. Roberto came up from New Mexico 3 years ago. He is quiet but has a sweet tooth like you would not believe." "And you?" Margaret asked. "What are your preferences?" Xavier considered the question. No one had asked him that in a long time. "I suppose I like things simple but done well. Real butter on bread instead of lard. Vegetables that still have some texture to them. My mother used to make this stew with beef and carrots and potatoes that I have not tasted the like of since she passed." Something in Margaret's expression shifted, became gentler. "I am sorry for your loss. It has been 2 years. You would think it would get easier, but some days it feels as fresh as if it happened yesterday." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically, until the ranch came into view. Xavier always felt a surge of pride when he saw it. The main house he had built with his own hands, the barn and corrals, the bunkhouse for the men, and the small cabin that had once been his first dwelling on the property before he built something larger. "That cabin there will be yours," he said, pointing. "It needs some fixing up, but it is sound. I will have the men help get it ready while you settle in." Margaret surveyed the property with an appraising eye. "It is a good piece of land. You have built something substantial here." Her words, simple as they were, touched something in Xavier. He had worked himself nearly to death to build this ranch, and hearing someone acknowledge it meant more than he cared to admit. The ranch hands emerged from the barn as Xavier helped Margaret down from the wagon. Tom scratched his graying beard and looked skeptical. Pete grinned with open curiosity, and Roberto nodded politely, hat in hand. "This is Miss Grayson," Xavier announced. "She will be cooking for us starting today. I expect you all to treat her with respect and stay out of her way while she works." "Yes, sir," they chorused, though Tom still looked dubious. Margaret faced them squarely. "Dinner will be at 6 o'clock sharp. I expect everyone to come to the table clean, with hats off and decent manners. If you have dietary restrictions or strong dislikes, tell me now so I can plan accordingly." Tom opened his mouth, probably to make some comment about fancy cooking, but Xavier silenced him with a look. "No restrictions, madam," Roberto said quietly. "We are grateful for whatever you prepare." Margaret nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now, Mr. O'Reilly, if you would show me the kitchen, I will assess what I have to work with." The kitchen was in the main house, a large room with a cast iron stove, a deep sink with a pump, and shelves that held a motley collection of mismatched dishes and poorly maintained pots. Margaret walked through it slowly, opening cupboards and examining the supplies with the focus of a general surveying a battlefield. "You have the basics," she said finally, "but you are low on almost everything. I will need to make a list for the next supply run." "Whatever you need," Xavier assured her, "within reason. I am not extravagant, Mr. O'Reilly, but I also will not serve meals made with inferior ingredients. Good food requires good materials." "Fair enough. I will leave you to get oriented. If you need anything, I will be out working the south pasture." Margaret had already tied on an apron and was pulling ingredients from the cupboards. "I will manage." Xavier left her to it, returning to the work that never seemed to end on a ranch. But throughout the day, he found his thoughts drifting back to the house, wondering what Margaret was preparing, if she would actually be able to deliver on the competence she projected. At 6 o'clock precisely, he and the ranch hands filed into the dining room, which adjoined the kitchen. Xavier had not used this room much, usually eating at the kitchen table if he ate inside at all. But Margaret had set the long table with proper place settings, napkins, and even a small vase of wildflowers in the center. The food she carried out made Tom's skeptical expression vanish instantly. There was roasted chicken with crispy skin, mashed potatoes with real butter, green beans cooked with onions and bacon, fresh biscuits that steamed when broken open, and rich gravy that smelled like heaven. "Lord have mercy," Pete whispered. They ate in near silence, except for the occasional appreciative grunt. Xavier tried to maintain some decorum, but the food was the best he had tasted since his mother's cooking. The chicken was tender and seasoned perfectly, the potatoes were creamy without being soupy, and the biscuits melted in his mouth. Margaret served them efficiently, refilling coffee cups and bringing out a dried apple pie for dessert that made Tom actually groan with pleasure. "Miss Grayson," Tom said, his earlier skepticism completely gone, "that was the finest meal I have had in my entire life." "I agree," Roberto added softly. "It reminds me of my mother's cooking." Pete was too busy eating his second slice of pie to comment verbally, but his expression said everything. Xavier met Margaret's eyes across the table. "You undersold your abilities, Miss Grayson. This was not just competent cooking. This was exceptional." A faint blush colored her cheeks, the first sign of anything other than confidence he had seen from her. "I am glad it was satisfactory. Now, if you gentlemen will excuse me, I need to clean up and prepare for tomorrow." "The men will help you clean," Xavier said, ignoring Tom's look of dismay. "It is the least we can do after a meal like that." They worked together to clear the table and wash the dishes, an unusual arrangement but one that felt right given how much effort Margaret had put into the meal. When everything was clean and put away, Xavier walked Margaret out to her cabin, carrying a lantern to light the way. "The men got your cabin ready while you were cooking," he said. "Put fresh linens on the bed and stocked the wood box for the stove. That was kind of them." They reached the cabin door, and awkward silence fell between them. Xavier was not used to having a woman on the property, was not sure of the protocols involved. "Miss Grayson," he said finally, "I want you to know that you are safe here. The men are good people, and I would never allow anyone to bother you or make you uncomfortable." Margaret studied his face in the lantern light. "I believe you, Mr. O'Reilly, and I want you to know that I am not fragile. I came west because I needed a fresh start, and I am prepared to work hard to build a life here. I appreciate the opportunity you have given me. The opportunity seems to be mine, if tonight's meal was any indication." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her serious face into something luminous. "Good night, Mr. O'Reilly." "Good night, Miss Grayson." Xavier walked back to the main house feeling lighter than he had in months. His stomach was full. His home smelled like good cooking instead of burnt beans, and the ranch somehow felt less lonely with Margaret Grayson in residence. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Margaret proved to be as competent as she had promised, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast, packing lunches for the men when they worked far pastures, and creating dinners that made coming back to the ranch house something to look forward to rather than just a necessity. She kept the kitchen spotlessly clean, organized the pantry with military precision, and even started a small herb garden behind the house. But it was more than just the food, Xavier realized as the weeks passed. Margaret brought life to the ranch in ways he had not anticipated. She hummed while she worked, the melodies drifting out through open windows. She left the door open on pleasant evenings, and the warm light and good smells made the house feel welcoming. She talked with the ranch hands during meals, asking about their days and actually listening to the answers, making each man feel valued and seen. Xavier found himself looking for excuses to come back to the house during the day, to check on something or grab a tool he did not really need. Margaret never commented on these visits, just offered him coffee and sometimes a sample of whatever she was baking. They would talk about simple things at first, the weather or the ranch operations, but gradually their conversations deepened. He learned that she had left Kansas after her father died, leaving debts that consumed the family restaurant and left her with nothing. Her mother had passed when she was young, and she had no siblings. She had come west seeking independence, a chance to build something that was entirely hers. "I was tired of depending on people who disappointed me," she said one afternoon while kneading bread dough. "My father was a good man but a poor businessman. He made promises he could not keep, and when he died, I was left to face the consequences. I decided I would rather face uncertainty on my own terms than security that depended on someone else's competence." Xavier understood that sentiment deeply. "That is why I bought this ranch. My father wanted me to work in his freight business, but I could not stomach the idea of spending my life in warehouses and offices. I wanted something that was mine, that I built with my own hands." "And you have built it well," Margaret said, shaping the dough into loaves. "You should be proud." He was proud, but having her acknowledge it made it feel more real somehow, more substantial. As summer faded into early autumn, Xavier became increasingly aware that his feelings for Margaret were shifting beyond professional appreciation. He noticed the way afternoon sunlight caught in her hair when she hung laundry. He found himself listening for her humming, feeling unsettled when the house was silent. He looked forward to dinner not just for the food, but for the hour spent in her company, watching her move gracefully around the table, listening to her laugh at Tom's terrible jokes. It was Tom who finally called him on it, catching him staring at Margaret through the kitchen window one afternoon when Xavier should have been working. "You planning on doing something about that, or just going to moon around like a lovesick calf?" the older man asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. Xavier jerked his attention back to the fence post he was supposed to be setting. "I do not know what you mean." "The hell you do not. You have been looking at Miss Grayson like she hung the moon and stars for the past month. Question is, does she feel the same way?" Xavier hammered the post harder than necessary. "She is my employee. It would not be appropriate." "Appropriate." Tom spat tobacco juice in the dirt. "Boy, you think too much. That woman cooks for us like we are family, doctors us when we are sick, and treats this ranch like it is her own. And I have seen the way she looks at you when you are not paying attention. Life is too short to hide behind what is appropriate." Roberto, working on the next fence post, added quietly, "Tom is right. Miss Grayson is a special woman. If you have feelings for her, you should speak honestly." "What is the worst that could happen?" "She could leave," Xavier said, voicing his deepest fear. "She could feel uncomfortable and leave, and then we would be back to burnt beans and loneliness. Or she could say yes," Pete chimed in, grinning. And then we would get to eat her cooking forever, and you would stop walking around like someone kicked your favorite dog. Xavier wanted to argue, but he could not deny the truth of what they were saying. He had feelings for Margaret Grayson, deep feelings that went far beyond appreciation for her cooking. The question was whether he had the courage to risk what they had for the possibility of something more. That evening, he stayed after dinner to help Margaret clean up, sending the ranch hands away despite their offers to help. Margaret gave him a curious look, but said nothing, just handed him a drying towel. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, washing and drying the dishes with practiced efficiency. Xavier rehearsed various speeches in his head, trying to find the right words, but everything sounded either too formal or too casual. "Mr. O'Reilly," Margaret said suddenly, "is something troubling you? You have been very quiet this evening." He set down the plate he was drying and turned to face her. "Margaret, there is something I need to say to you, and I am not entirely sure how to say it properly." She dried her hands on her apron, her green eyes steady on his face. "I find direct honesty usually works best." "All right, then. Direct honesty." He took a breath. "These past few months have been the best I can remember since my mother died. Not just because of your cooking, though that has been wonderful, but because you have made this ranch feel like a home. You have brought life and warmth to a place that was starting to feel like just buildings and work. And I have found myself developing feelings for you that go beyond professional appreciation." Margaret's expression remained calm, but he saw her hands tighten slightly on the edge of the counter. "What kind of feelings?" "The kind that make me look for excuses to come back to the house during the day. The kind that make your smile the best part of my evening. The kind that make me think about a future that is not just about building a ranch, but about building a life with someone." "With me," she said quietly. "With you. If you could possibly feel the same way, I understand if you do not. I understand if this makes you uncomfortable and you want to maintain our professional relationship. But Tom pointed out, quite correctly, that life is too short to hide behind propriety when you care about someone." A slow smile spread across Margaret's face, the kind of smile that lit her up from the inside. "Tom said that. I would not have guessed he had such romantic sensibilities. He also called me a lovesick calf, if that makes you feel better about his character." Margaret laughed, a warm sound that filled the kitchen. Then she stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Xavier," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I came to Colorado looking for independence and a fresh start. I was not looking for love. I had convinced myself that I was better off alone, that depending on anyone else would only lead to disappointment." His heart sank, but she was not finished. "But you have shown me something different. You have shown me that partnership does not have to mean loss of independence. You respect my work, you value my opinions, and you have given me space to be myself without expectation or demand. And yes, I have feelings for you too. I have tried to ignore them, to tell myself that they were inappropriate or unwise, but I cannot deny them anymore." Relief and joy flooded through Xavier in equal measure. "So what do we do now?" "Now," Margaret said, "I think you should kiss me." He did not need to be told twice. He cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her, soft at first, then deeper as she responded. She tasted like apple pie and coffee, and her arms came up around his neck, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Xavier felt like the world had shifted on its axis in the best possible way. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I know," Margaret said, smiling. "I could tell. You are not as subtle as you think you are." Apparently everyone could tell. Even Pete, and he is usually oblivious to anything that does not involve horses or food. They stood there for a moment, just holding each other, the kitchen warm around them and the evening light fading outside the windows. Xavier felt a contentment he had not known was possible, a sense of rightness that went bone deep. "So where do we go from here?" he asked. "I do not want to rush you or make you feel pressured." Margaret leaned back to look at him seriously. "I think we should be honest with the men about our relationship. They deserve to know. But I would like to take things slowly in terms of anything more. I have been burned before by rushing into situations without thinking them through clearly." "We will go as slowly as you need," Xavier promised. "I am not going anywhere, and neither is the ranch. We have all the time in the world." They told the ranch hands the next morning over breakfast. Tom grinned widely and said he had known all along. Roberto offered his quiet congratulations, and Pete just asked if this meant Margaret would be staying permanently, because he could not face going back to Xavier's cooking. Life continued on the ranch, but with a new dimension of happiness woven through it. Xavier and Margaret were careful to maintain propriety. No public displays of affection beyond occasionally holding hands, but their relationship deepened steadily. They took walks together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. Xavier showed her his favorite spots on the ranch: the high meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring, the creek bend where he sometimes saw deer drinking at dawn, the outlook where you could see 3 mountain peaks painted gold by the setting sun. Margaret shared more about her past, the hard years after her mother died when she had taken over much of the cooking at her father's restaurant at age 12, the constant struggle to make ends meet, the humiliation of watching creditors pick through her family's belongings after her father's death. "I was so angry," she admitted one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house watching the stars emerge. "Angry at him for dying. Angry at myself for not seeing how bad the financial situation was. Angry at the world for being so harsh and unforgiving. I came west thinking I would just build a new life and never depend on anyone again. But you have shown me that anger is a poor foundation for a life." "What would be a better foundation?" Xavier asked. "This," she said simply. "Partnership, respect. Building something together instead of just protecting yourself from being hurt." As autumn deepened, preparations began for winter. Xavier and the men brought cattle down from the high pastures, repaired buildings, and stocked supplies. Margaret preserved vegetables from her garden, dried herbs, and laid in stores of flour and sugar and coffee to last through the long Colorado winter. The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that melted by mid-morning. Xavier found Margaret standing at the kitchen window watching the flakes fall, an expression on her face he could not quite read. "What are you thinking?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "I am thinking that this is the first time I have looked forward to winter," she said. "Usually it just means cold and hardship and counting supplies to make sure you do not run out before spring. But here, now, I find myself excited about it. Cozy evenings by the fire, cooking hearty stews, having everyone gathered close. Having someone to be close with," Xavier added. She smiled and leaned into him. "Yes, that too." The relationship between them continued to deepen through the winter months. They were together constantly, working side by side on daily tasks, sharing meals, talking for hours by the fireplace after the ranch hands retired to the bunkhouse. Xavier learned the small things about her: that she was left-handed, that she sang slightly off-key when she thought no one was listening, that she had a fierce, competitive streak when they played cards. Margaret learned his habits too, that he woke before dawn and liked to watch the sunrise with his first cup of coffee, that he had a habit of running his hand through his hair when he was frustrated, that despite his competent exterior, he had moments of deep insecurity about whether he was doing right by his men and his land. It was during one of these quiet evenings in December that Xavier brought up the subject that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. "Margaret," he said, watching the fire dance in the hearth, "I need to know where you see this relationship going." She looked up from the sock she was darning. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I am in love with you. Completely, irrevocably in love with you. And I want to marry you, want to make this official and permanent. But I will not pressure you if you are not ready or if you have doubts." Margaret set down her darning and moved to sit beside him. "I have no doubts about my feelings. I love you too, Xavier. But marriage is a serious commitment and I need to be honest with you about my fears." "Tell me." "I am afraid of losing myself again," she said quietly. "When I worked in my father's restaurant, I had no identity separate from being his daughter, his helper. My wants and needs and dreams were always secondary to keeping the business running. I came here determined to be my own person, and I am afraid that marriage will require me to give that up." Xavier took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I fell in love with you because of who you are, Margaret, not despite it. Your strength, your independence, your capability. I do not want you to become some diminished version of yourself. I want a partner, not a servant or a decoration. We would build our life together, making decisions together, supporting each other's dreams." "You mean that?" "I do. And I will spend every day proving it to you if you will let me." Tears shone in Margaret's eyes, but she was smiling. "Then yes, yes, I will marry you." Xavier pulled her close and kissed her, the fire crackling beside them, snow falling softly outside the windows. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I will make you happy," he promised. "I swear it." "You already do," she replied. They were married on a cold, clear day in January of 1884, in the small church in Auray with Tom, Roberto, and Pete serving as witnesses. Margaret wore a new dress the color of deep blue velvet, and Xavier wore his best suit, the one he had bought for his mother's funeral but had not worn since. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier felt like he had been given a gift he had not known he was seeking. They held a small celebration at the ranch afterward, with Margaret having prepared a feast that made their wedding dinner a meal the ranch hands would talk about for years. There was roasted beef and potatoes, fresh bread with butter, 3 different kinds of vegetables, and a cake that Margaret had somehow managed to make beautiful despite the limited decorating supplies available. "To the happy couple," Tom toasted, raising his glass of whiskey. "May they have many years of happiness and good cooking." "And many children to help with the ranch work," Pete added, grinning. "And may they always find joy in each other," Roberto said quietly, and it was his toast that touched them both most deeply. That night, Xavier carried Margaret over the threshold of the main house, which was now officially their home. She had moved her belongings from the cabin over the past week, merging her life with his in practical ways, but this felt different, more significant. "Are you nervous?" he asked her as they stood in the bedroom, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. "A little," she admitted, "but more excited than nervous. I trust you, Xavier, I trust us." He kissed her softly. "We will learn this together. There is no rush, no expectation except that we love each other." What followed was tender and passionate by turns. 2 people learning each other in new ways, building intimacy that went beyond words. Xavier had been with a woman before, a brief relationship years ago that had ended amicably, but this was different. This was Margaret, the woman he loved, the woman he had chosen and who had chosen him. Every touch, every whispered word felt precious and significant. Afterward they lay tangled together, Margaret's head resting on Xavier's chest, his arm around her shoulders. "I did not know it could be like that," she said softly. "So gentle and patient. Was there someone before?" Xavier asked, trying to keep any jealousy from his voice. "A man in Topeka before my father died. He courted me for a few months, and I thought perhaps we might marry. He was passionate but selfish, always concerned with his own pleasure. When my father died and I lost everything, he disappeared. I have not thought of him in months until just now, and only to realize how different this is, how different you are." Xavier tightened his arm around her. "I will never disappear on you. Whatever we face together." "I know," she said. "That is why I married you." The winter passed in contentment. Xavier and Margaret fell into the rhythms of married life, learning to navigate shared space and make joint decisions. Margaret continued cooking for the ranch hands, but now she and Xavier ate breakfast together before the men arrived, treasuring that quiet time alone. She reorganized the house to reflect both their tastes, adding small touches of beauty where before there had been only function. Xavier found himself working with renewed purpose, not just to build the ranch but to build a legacy, something to pass on to the children he hoped they would have. He discussed plans with Margaret, valuing her input on everything from which cattle to buy to how to better organize the barn. "You have a good head for business," he told her one evening as they reviewed the ranch accounts together. "My father taught me bookkeeping," she said. "It was one of the few useful things I learned from watching his mistakes. He never planned ahead, never saved for difficulties. I learned to do the opposite." "Then you should handle our accounts," Xavier said. "You are better at it than I am, and I trust your judgment completely." It was a small thing, but Margaret's expression showed how much it meant to her. This evidence that he truly did see her as a partner, not just a wife. Spring came early that year, the snow melting rapidly and the meadows erupting in wildflowers. Xavier and the men began the work of spring roundup, gathering cattle for branding and counting. It was hard, exhausting work, but Margaret made sure they ate well, preparing hearty meals that kept their energy up. It was in late April that Margaret told Xavier she was pregnant. She waited until they were alone after dinner, the evening light soft through the windows. "I have news," she said, her hands folded in front of her. Xavier looked up from the harness he was mending. "What kind of news?" "The best kind. We are going to have a baby." For a moment Xavier could not speak. Joy, pure and overwhelming, flooded through him. He crossed to Margaret in 2 long strides and gathered her into his arms. "Truly?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Truly. I am about 2 months along, I think. The baby should come in November." Xavier kissed her, then knelt and kissed her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one. I am your father, and I already love you more than I thought possible." Margaret ran her fingers through his hair, tears streaming down her face. "I was afraid to hope for this. Afraid that I was too old or that something would go wrong. You are only 25, hardly too old, and nothing will go wrong. We will take care of you, make sure you rest and eat well and do not overdo things." "I still want to cook," Margaret said firmly. "I need to feel useful." "Then you will cook, but with help. I will hire a girl from town to assist you, and the men can take on more of the cleaning duties. You will not exhaust yourself," they told the ranch hands at breakfast the next morning. The men reacted with genuine joy, offering congratulations and making suggestions about baby names that were alternately touching and ridiculous. "If it is a boy, you should name him after me," Tom said. "Thomas is a strong name." "Or Roberto," Roberto offered. "It means bright fame." "Peter is a good solid name," Pete added. Xavier laughed. "And if it is a girl?" The men looked stumped for a moment, then Tom said, "Well, Margaret is a fine name. You could just name her after her mother." "We have time to decide," Margaret said, smiling at their enthusiasm. "But I appreciate the suggestions." True to his word, Xavier hired a girl from town, a sweet 16-year-old named Sarah who was happy for the work and eager to learn from Margaret. Margaret taught her cooking techniques and recipes, finding that she enjoyed passing on her knowledge. Sarah was quick to learn and respectful, and she and Margaret developed an easy working relationship. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed, Xavier found himself hovering, worrying about every small thing. Margaret bore his concern with patience, though she occasionally had to remind him that pregnancy was not an illness. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, she pointed out when he fretted about her carrying a basket of vegetables from the garden. I am healthy and strong. A little work will not hurt me or the baby. Still, Xavier could not help worrying. Margaret was his world, and the thought of anything happening to her terrified him. He read every book about pregnancy and childbirth he could find, much to the amusement of the ranch hands. You are acting like you are the first man to ever become a father, Tom teased. Let him fuss, Margaret said. It is sweet. The summer passed peacefully. The ranch prospered, the cattle fattened on good grass, and Margaret bloomed with pregnancy. She moved more slowly as her belly grew, but she maintained her routines, cooking and managing the household with the help of Sarah. Xavier made sure Margaret rested every afternoon, often joining her to read aloud or just sit together. They talked about the baby, about their hopes and dreams, about the kind of parents they wanted to be. I want our children to feel valued, Margaret said one afternoon, her hand resting on her rounded belly. To know that their thoughts and feelings matter. They will, Xavier promised. We will make sure of it. In September, as Margaret entered her final months of pregnancy, they began preparing for the baby in earnest. Xavier built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving simple designs along the edges. Margaret sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her stitches careful and precise. The ranch hands contributed too, Tom whittling small toys, Roberto weaving a soft basket for the baby's things, Pete somehow acquiring a beautiful christening gown from a relative back east. You are all going to spoil this child terribly, Margaret said, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears at their generosity. The baby came on a cold November night, 3 weeks earlier than they had expected. Margaret woke Xavier in the early hours of the morning, her face calm but her voice tight with pain. The baby is coming. You need to get the midwife. Xavier dressed faster than he ever had in his life and rode hell for leather into town, waking the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, and bringing her back to the ranch. By the time they arrived, Margaret's contractions were coming hard and fast, and Sarah was with her, holding her hand and offering what comfort she could. Mrs. Henderson took charge immediately, sending Xavier out of the room despite his protests. This is women's work, she said firmly. You will just be in the way. Go boil water and pace if you must, but stay out of my way. Xavier spent the next hours in an agony of worry, listening to Margaret's cries of pain through the closed door. Tom, Roberto, and Pete kept him company, offering whiskey and distraction, but nothing helped. All Xavier could do was pray that Margaret and the baby would be all right. Finally, as dawn light began to creep through the windows, he heard a new sound, the thin, angry wail of a newborn. Relief so intense it made him dizzy flooded through him. Moments later, Mrs. Henderson opened the door, smiling. You have a son, she said, and your wife did beautifully. Come meet your boy. Xavier entered the room on shaking legs. Margaret lay propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Xavier approached slowly, almost afraid this was a dream. Xavier, Margaret said softly, meet your son. He looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes, though barely open, seemed to be dark blue. Xavier felt his heart expand in his chest, making room for this new, overwhelming love. "He is beautiful," Xavier whispered. "You are both beautiful. You want to hold him." Xavier sat carefully on the edge of the bed and let Margaret transfer the baby into his arms. The weight was negligible, but the responsibility felt enormous. This tiny person depended on them completely, trusted them to keep him safe and loved and healthy. "Hello, son," Xavier said, his voice breaking. "I am your father, and I promise you I will do everything in my power to give you a good life." The baby made a small sound, and Xavier felt tears spill down his cheeks. Margaret reached up and wiped them away gently. "What should we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on one. Looking at his son's face now, Xavier knew exactly what felt right. "William," he said. "After my father. He was not a perfect man, but he loved me in his way. William James O'Reilly." "William James," Margaret repeated, testing the name. "I like it, Billy for short." The ranch hands were allowed in later that morning to meet the new arrival. They filed in quietly, hats in hands, looking at the baby with wonder. "He is so small," Pete said, amazed. "He will grow," Tom assured him. "And fast, too. Before you know it, he will be running around getting into everything." Roberto asked if he could hold the baby, and Margaret agreed. The quiet man cradled Billy with surprising gentleness, speaking to him in soft Spanish. "He will be a good boy," Roberto said. "I can tell. He has a peaceful spirit." Billy proved to be an easy baby, crying only when hungry or needing his diaper changed. Margaret nursed him, marveling at the primal bond that formed through that simple act. Xavier helped whenever he could, walking Billy when he fussed at night, changing diapers without complaint, singing off-key lullabies that somehow soothed the baby even if they made Margaret smile. Life on the ranch adjusted to accommodate the new arrival. Margaret returned to cooking once she recovered from the birth. But Sarah took on more responsibilities, giving Margaret time to care for Billy. The baby spent much of his time in a basket near the warm stove, where Margaret could watch him while she worked. As winter set in again, the ranch felt more like a home than ever before. The sound of Billy's cries and coos filled the house, a reminder that they had built something lasting, something beyond just land and cattle. They were a family now, connected by bonds of love and commitment. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire with Billy sleeping in Xavier's arms, Margaret looked around their home with deep satisfaction. "Do you remember when we first met?" she asked. "When you thought you were just hiring a cook?" Xavier smiled, remembering that awkward first meeting at the boarding house. "I had no idea what I was really getting. I thought I needed someone to make decent meals. I did not realize I needed someone to make my life complete." "You prepared a feast for my lonely soul," Margaret said softly. "You gave me safety and respect and partnership. You let me be myself while also being part of something larger." "We saved each other," Xavier said. "You brought life and warmth to this place. You turned a house into a home, work into purpose. I was just going through the motions before you came. Now everything has meaning." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire dance, listening to Billy's soft breathing. Outside, snow fell gently, blanketing the ranch in quiet white. Inside, all was warm and peaceful and full of love. The years that followed were good ones. Billy grew from a baby into a toddler, then a bright, curious child who followed his father everywhere, asking endless questions about the ranch and the cattle and the horses. Margaret had 2 more children, a daughter named Elizabeth 2 years after Billy, and another son named Thomas 3 years after that, much to Tom's delight. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Margaret's business acumen and Xavier's skill with cattle and land proved to be a powerful combination. They expanded their holdings, bought better breeding stock, and built a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as Denver. But more than the material success, it was the life they built together that mattered most. They raised their children with love and respect, teaching them the value of hard work while also encouraging their individual interests and dreams. Billy showed an early talent for working with horses. Elizabeth inherited her mother's skill in the kitchen and her father's head for business, and young Thomas had a gentle way with animals that reminded everyone of Roberto. The ranch hands remained part of their extended family. Tom stayed on until he was too old to work, at which point Xavier built him a small cottage on the property where he lived out his final years, still dispensing advice and terrible jokes. Roberto married a woman from town and brought his family to live in the old foreman's cabin, raising his own children alongside Xavier and Margaret's. Pete eventually left to start his own ranch, but he visited regularly, always welcomed with a good meal and warm hospitality. Sarah continued working for the family, becoming not just an employee but a trusted friend. She eventually married one of the ranch hands Xavier hired to replace Tom, and they too built their life connected to the O'Reilly ranch. As the children grew, Xavier and Margaret's love deepened and matured. They weathered difficulties together, a particularly harsh winter that killed part of their herd, an illness that swept through the area and nearly took Elizabeth, financial panics that affected cattle prices. Through it all, they stood together, drawing strength from each other and from the partnership they had built. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier took Margaret back to the spot where he had first told her he loved her, the high meadow full of wildflowers. They left the children with Sarah for the afternoon and rode out together, the June day warm and perfect. "You remember," Xavier asked as they dismounted, "when I posted that advertisement for a cook? How could I forget? It changed my entire life." "Mine too. I thought I just needed someone to prepare decent meals. I had no idea I was finding my soulmate." Margaret moved into his arms, fitting against him as perfectly as she had that first night in the kitchen. "You prepared a feast for my lonely soul. You gave me everything I did not know I was searching for. And you gave me a home, a family, a reason to build something lasting. You turned my carefully ordered loneliness into a life full of love and chaos and joy." They kissed, long and sweet, the mountains rising around them and the wildflowers swaying in the breeze. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. "Another 10 years?" Margaret asked. "Another 50 if we are lucky," Xavier replied. They were lucky. They had many more years together, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own. Billy took over management of the ranch eventually, applying his own innovations while respecting the foundation his parents had built. Elizabeth opened a restaurant in Ouray that became famous throughout the region, serving the recipes her mother had taught her with her own creative additions. Thomas became a veterinarian, the first in the county, and traveled around caring for animals while always making the ranch his home base. Xavier and Margaret grew old together gracefully, their love never dimming even as their hair turned gray and their steps slowed. They still took walks in the evenings, still sat together by the fire in winter, still found joy in each other's company after decades of marriage. When Xavier died at the age of 76, peacefully in his sleep after a full day of watching his grandchildren play, Margaret grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 48 years together, years full of love and partnership and shared purpose. She lived 4 more years after his death, surrounded by the family they had built, and when her time came, she went peacefully, knowing she had lived a full and meaningful life. They were buried side by side in a plot overlooking the ranch, under the same mountains that had witnessed their love story. Their children erected a simple stone marker that read, Xavier and Margaret O'Reilly. They built a life of love. And indeed, they had a legacy that lived on in their descendants, in the ranch that still bore their name, and in the example they set of what true partnership could be. The story of how Xavier O'Reilly thought he was hiring a cook, but found instead the love of his life became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It was a reminder that sometimes what we need most is not what we think we are looking for, that opening our hearts to possibility can lead us to places we never imagined. Margaret had prepared meals that nourished their bodies, but more importantly, she had prepared a feast for Xavier's lonely soul, filling his life with warmth and love and meaning. And Xavier, for his part, had given Margaret the partnership and respect she craved, creating a space where she could be fully herself while also being part of something larger. Together, they built not just a successful ranch, but a true home, a place where love flourished and family thrived across the generations. Their great-grandchildren still live on the ranch today, working the same land, surrounded by the same mountains, carrying forward the values of hard work, mutual respect, and deep love that Xavier and Margaret established all those years ago. The old main house still stands, updated and modernized but retaining its essential character. And in the kitchen, hanging in a place of honor, is a worn recipe book filled with Margaret's careful handwriting, each recipe annotated with notes and memories from a life well lived. On quiet evenings when the work is done and the family gathers for dinner, they sometimes speak of Xavier and Margaret, remembering the love story that started it all. And in those moments, it feels as though the old couple is still there somehow, their love woven so deeply into the fabric of the ranch that it can never truly fade. The wildflowers still bloom in the high meadow every June, the creek still runs clear and cold from the mountains, and the sunset still paints the peaks in shades of gold and pink. It is a testament to the power of love, the kind that grows slowly but runs deep, built on foundation of mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine partnership. Xavier and Margaret found each other when they both needed it most, two lonely souls who combined to create something beautiful and lasting. Their story reminds us that love often comes when we least expect it, disguised as something ordinary, a job advertisement or a business arrangement, only to reveal itself as extraordinary, life-changing, the answer to questions we did not know we were asking. And so their legacy lives on, not just in the land and buildings and bloodline, but in the example they set, the proof that true love exists, that partnership between equals creates something stronger than either person alone, that opening your heart to possibility, even when it is frightening, can lead to the greatest joy imaginable. Xavier thought he was hiring a cook that day in 1883 when he posted his advertisement in Cowboy, Colorado. But what he really did was invite his destiny to walk into his life. And Margaret, seeking only a job and a fresh start, found instead a home, a partner, and a love that would sustain her for the rest of her days. It was, in every sense, a feast for two lonely souls who discovered that together they were complete.